Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of Signal with Snorlax, brought to you by Because Bitcoin, and of course me, Snorlax. Some of you guys might know me as Tommy if you watch Market Check, but I don't know how many weeks in a row I'm gonna have to be able to be like, yeah, we did it again, guys. Signal with Snorlax, and the market is red. Another Thursday nuke. So I figured, we might as well just title the video after what's kind of becoming a running joke, and obviously answer the question of when bottom. Because we look at Bitcoin, man. It's like for the pretty much the last week, I think, since I spoke with you guys, we've kind of just been doing this almost like slow grind down. I want to say this was the last Thursday move, and we've just had like this very choppy downtrending PA after we broke down from a range. And I want to redraw this range here because I do think it's significant in the sense that we basically developed value between May and obviously until mid-November between 100K and effectively the all-time highs on Bitcoin. So we have transacted. I want to say I saw a tweet earlier this week or last week where like 25% of the total Bitcoin supply has been transacted up at these prices, which is outrageous for the record when you consider how long Bitcoin has I guess been in this like perpetual uptrend over the last like 10 to 15 years. To do 25% of the supply in just 6 months is quite significant. So we know from a positioning standpoint that a lot happened in here. Therefore, we know the unwind is probably not going to be just like a fake out. It will likely take some time to resolve. I talked about this with our Discord earlier this week, but when we've had ranges in the past throughout this cycle, with the exception of if they didn't immediately make a V recovery, using SVB here as an example, you really just got these lockout trends when the value area broke. So with Bitcoin, right, we effectively had this range that, when we broke out of it, there was no retest. And Bitcoin ended up marking up like 150% in 6 months. So now, you'll often hear order flow traders, and to be honest, I'm not like the biggest fan of order flow these days because I think a lot of the signal has been diluted to an extent. I am going to talk a little bit about derivatives today, but I do think what the order flow guys always get right is when we trade within a value area, a range for as long as we have, and you break, your first thought, if you don't immediately see reversion, should not be to fade the compression break, right? And I feel like that's what we've seen basically throughout this most recent leg of the downtrend. We're trading about 15% below our prior range lows of a 6 to 8 month period. And despite this, funding is still positive. Open interest is basically back to October 10th levels. And again, I'm going to talk about that exactly on this show. But right now we are in a downtrend. And I think you could argue that 100K, even this price action that we're seeing right here, is still closer to the early stages of that trend than the latter stages. And I know that's kind of a scary thought, especially because a lot of the people who have been around this cycle haven't really seen Bitcoin have a drawdown this large, right? We've almost kind of had this new paradigm per se, where Bitcoin is just incredibly strong. It can't dump. But I would also caution that sentiment, that rhetoric, that don't forget what asset class you're trading, guys. This is crypto. This is Bitcoin. These big moves, this volatility back and forth is a feature just as much as a bug. So just because Bitcoin hasn't seen that big downside yet this cycle, like it has seen in previous cycles, and even like mid-cycle, right? It doesn't even have to be an end of cycle thing. It could actually be kind of, as we've seen before, these violent Bitcoin moves can actually set the stage for eventual uptrends. We don't forget that this is Bitcoin we're talking about, right? Not a Mag 7 stock. This is Bitcoin, and we have even like 2 or 3 years ago, I mean, just we've had these like massive moves in both directions. So don't forget what asset you're trading. But when bottom, at this point, I know a lot of people are going to be prospecting a low within here because we have these FVGs, because we have, I would imagine, a high volume node effectively from the April range that we traded in before we bottomed and eventually moved higher. At the same time, I mean, I look at these high time frame momentum readings, the weekly, the monthly, I guess the monthly hasn't crossed that 50 level. If it does, you're going to get a big puke. But if this 3-day really accepts into this oversold territory, you know, I've been saying for a while that I think if we break from this range, you don't want to catch that knife. I feel somewhat validated at this point, continuing to hold that belief that, you know, what if we just make the whole move in one go? What if it's just my background, right? The bear watching the watching the nuke from the window. And I think there's volume that backs this up as well. It might not be quite as clean on Bitstamp because we haven't transacted as much volume on this exchange, or maybe it is cleaner. I guess we'll see here. But as you guys can see, we have this high volume node here that we are effectively trading below now. So it's currently supply, but there's really not that much on a relative basis. The volume that we've transacted above 95 to 100K is much larger than any of the volume that we see until at least 70. So you'd be hoping that this high volume node on Bitstamp, on Coinbase, on Binance, it's everywhere. You'd hope that that is going to eventually catch price, but it does tell us that, you know, it probably doesn't make that much sense to begin prospecting a long-term bottom. Sure, there could be bounces. I don't really think that we're going to get bounces, but there can absolutely be bounces. And I think you need to be very mindful of the fact that with realized volatility this high, you know, you can get squeezed out of shorts quite easily and have the downtrend still resume with as much velocity and fervor as it seemingly had for the last 1 to 2 weeks. But this seems like momentum that is accelerating. I want to say we talked about that last week being a possibility. And for me, you know, we've got the structural confluence, but I would also add with what we're seeing with MicroStrategy now, which maybe that plays out, maybe it doesn't, who knows, right? I made a comparison on X that this is basically like the Luna fractal from the last cycle, where you had kind of like this consolidation into a big push higher. You had a complacency shoulder, which on Luna, for the record, there is a discernible difference. It made a higher high versus the initial structural high, and then it went to zero. And this is a stock, so like I really don't think that it will go to actual zero, but we have been seeing, I think, selling accelerate on MicroStrategy as well, and that's something that you really need to be mindful of. Have we reached a point where MicroStrategy is going to have to start selling Bitcoin? Now, everybody said this isn't possible, but if they don't sell Bitcoin, in theory, the stock can absolutely continue to be sold. Should the underlying asset that they hold, which is Bitcoin, continue to slide. So I think that needs to be acknowledged, right? It's almost like you want to wait for MicroStrategy, because if this is leading Bitcoin, MicroStrategy made new lows from March and April. Bitcoin has not done this. If MicroStrategy is leading Bitcoin, we want to wait for MicroStrategy to find a bottom before we bid, before we try to prospect our long-term bottom for BTC and probably every other asset in the space. But I think this can kind of be like your template, more or less. What is MicroStrategy going to do? But what we do know structurally, if it's ahead of Bitcoin, there probably is more pain for Bitcoin USD coming. And I think the price action that we're seeing over the last few days really kind of confirms this, quite frankly. As far as altcoins go, where are we prospecting a bottom on something like ETH, on Sol? Well, you know, it's going to come down to Bitcoin at the end of the day. Oh man, that's a tough look, isn't it? That's a tough look. Well, yeah, like I said, you know, we want Bitcoin to, and MicroStrategy to an extent, also find a low before we can start guessing where ETH and Sol are going to be. I've been pretty vocal, and going to continue to be vocal about the fact that I think altcoins in general are going to be harder to prospect downside on than Bitcoin, just because we've flushed out a significant amount of leverage. I do think ETH can be an exception to this because we have treasury companies that are probably bag holding billions of dollars of underwater ether at this point. But, you know, something like Sol, something like Hyperliquid, for example, should remain stronger than I think Bitcoin through a market downturn. That's not to say these assets are going to be safe havens if Bitcoin starts to sell off, or sell off more, I should say. We're already selling off. But they will, I think, bounce back much stronger. You've kind of seen this reflected throughout the price action on ETH BTC over the last month since 1010. Every dump that we've had on ETH BTC has recovered effectively. And yes, it's still kind of bleeding after that's done, but I do think that shows there is a certain level of demand for these altcoins. Are people sick of Bitcoin? Do people think that this has run its course? I'm not going to speculate on any of that. But obviously I have been prospecting downside on Bitcoin and crypto for a few months now. So I feel like we're playing it out right now. I do think it will play out rather quickly at the end of the day. And I think that we're probably very, very close to seeing selling accelerate. Low-key already seeing it this morning. As far as like if you want to prospect the bottom. BNB, I want to say when BNB breaks this 1010 wick, if BNB breaks this 1010 wick, I always got to preface it by saying that I'm going to single-handedly bear post so much during this video. I'm going to put a bottom in by myself, but I think if BNB breaks down from this wick at 1010, you will likely see selling accelerate. And this is where I will go talk about derivatives. Hold on, let me share Velo. Let's look at Bitcoin here, guys. Like the derivatives. How is this even possible? I'm asking myself. You know, we've got funding positive, while open interest on at least on Binance futures is back at the 1010 highs. That is I don't know what to make of that, right? I mean, I think it's a touch concerning. I'll be honest, especially, you know, when we see this much effort being put in, not just on Bitcoin over the last week, but you kind of add that with the context of BNB holding just above the 1010 wick. What's hiding below there? What's hiding below there? And now I don't want to say there aren't shorts in the system, because they are. And you can clearly see that in kind of these like downward spikes in funding that have occurred throughout the downtrend. But in general, when we see Bitcoin hit this prolonged period of negative funding, it has, I mean, throughout the cycle been a very, very like good bottom signal for price. And it doesn't even have to go negative. But when you're kind of feigning it, because crypto is such an asymmetrically skewed asset class to the upside, in general, anybody who has the chance to be paid to be long, like that's a bottom. Historically speaking, it's usually a very high percentage bottom. So the fact that we're still seeing funding positive and at times even rise throughout a downtrend that seemingly continues to steepen, and open interest just mooning, I have to wonder what is going on, man. What is going on, and how is this going to unwind? How is this going to unwind? But let me get back to my chart now. How do I even do that? Hold on. I'm not the most proficient with StreamYard, but we do our best. Yeah, I think this 1010 wick holds significance, but clearly people are hiding out in two assets right now, Hyperliquid and Zcash. And I can't say I can fault them at the end of the day, you know, because these assets have been so dramatically stronger than the market. It's almost kind of like outrageous at this point, especially Hyperliquid. I mean, I have friends who have been joking about it because I thought we'd have this opportunity to buy the dip on it. And it just, you know, it hasn't arisen yet. But I do think it's coming. I think when you start to see Hyperliquid really capitulate, we'll probably be very, very close to the bottom. So when bottom, probably when we see hyperliquid, like really nuking with the rest of the market. Or it's going to be strong. You're never going to get a dip, and Bitcoin is bottomed here. But I don't really think that's a super likely scenario based on what we're seeing right now. And why do I not think why do I not agree with the V recovery context? All right, let's pivot here real quick and talk about equity markets, because I think it obviously plays a huge role in how we're viewing things at the moment. We have the S&P. I guess we'll start with NVIDIA actually, because NVIDIA had earnings yesterday. And, we had a 6 or 7% gap up after hours. Obviously, we got it at New York Open, but we've retraced the entire thing. And I mean, maybe we close green today, maybe we don't. The fact that we retraced the whole thing, the market isn't moving higher on the things that used to send it parabolically. I mean, and I remember NVIDIA earnings. Do you guys remember when NVIDIA gapped up like 20 to 30% after hours or something ridiculous like that? I think it was this. Oh my God. Where were you when NVIDIA put in that meat stick? I remember that vividly. But yeah, I mean, the things that used to move the market higher are clearly, maybe they're not gone, but they've clearly hit this point locally where they're not moving the market higher. That much we can see. And I won't get on the whole soapbox talking about VIX futures. I've probably talked about that like every week for the last month. So I'm sure you guys are like almost nauseated at this point, having to hear me talk about it. But I still think that's like your visual representation of market liquidity. And, we have these amazing fundamental catalysts for the next 5 to 10 years. But at the same time, liquidity constraints exist. And that's how we can kind of pick out these spots where, all right, selling can occur here. And right now we're seeing, I really feel like we're seeing crypto lead the equity market as far as pricing goes. I was talking to a friend earlier today he doesn't hold any crypto. He's all in equities. He holds a big chunk of NVIDIA. And I'm telling him, I'm like, look, I mean, you got this gap up on NVIDIA. I would personally, not financial advice, never financial advice. I would be a seller at these prices. And he totally wrote me off. And I said, I think crypto is leading equities. And he says, I don't trade that. I don't care. And I think that's kind of like that is kind of symbolic of how I think a lot of people who deal mostly with stocks view crypto. They don't trade it. They think it's a scam. And while they might not be wrong necessarily, that's still, almost ignoring a more liquidity sensitive sector within the market that tends to communicate these trend shifts much earlier than you see from equity markets. So, what more can you say? As far as other small caps related to crypto and just in general, I've obviously been kind of looking at Robinhood as another, potential signal for the market that we could be seeing a sell-off soon. This is an asset that has had 50% pullbacks already throughout this market cycle. I don't think it should be out of the question that can happen, especially now at this point that it's only like 75. We're already 2/3 of the way there anyway. I guess the question is like, how deep does this go if we get a real spike on the VIX? Because the Mag 7 isn't really selling off. NVIDIA is only, I know it had a big gap up that got retraced, but it's still only down -2.5%. The S&P is back at levels not seen since 6 weeks ago. So really, equities have not puked, unless you think something like Robinhood is potentially leading some of these similar looking structures up here on the S&P. And then you have to ask yourself, all right, how deep are some of these things going to trade if we get a real spike on the VIX, which has just been doing this slow grind up for the last month? Are we about to see this spike higher? It's not going to do it without a catalyst, right? It's not going to do it without a catalyst. So I guess we'll just have to see. But I think if you are kind of like in this spot now where if we see a big spike on Vol, the market is going to nosedive. And I know it kind of already feels like that if you're in crypto, but it's going to be very volatile and very treacherous, I would imagine, for every asset involved. It's just kind of really that simple at the end of the day. We have a market that, especially things like Bitcoin and these larger cap assets, it's not really designed to consistently deal with these spikes on the VIX. We've had 2 in the last 15 months above the 50 level. So if that happens again, yeah, you're gonna have a tough time. And what I think you're going to see, because we've seen it before, and I guess I'll end with this. You know, we've seen this before with crypto, where you get the bleed, the downtrend, something feels off, right? But you can't really put your finger on it because equities have been really strong. If you remember during 2020, I wasn't trading the market back then, but obviously I study history, I study trends. I am a student of price action. That's kind of a lame thing to say. I don't know. I try to go back and see as much price action that's occurred in the past as I can. You know, when this happened with Bitcoin in 2020, and I don't know if something's going to happen like this to Bitcoin, just for the record, but we saw this shoulder form. Equities made a higher high when they formed this shoulder, and then everything sold off together. So I'm kind of asking myself, all right, are we about to see the same thing where we've seen crypto creep down? Really, I mean, I know it's down a good bit from the highs, but the selling has been very controlled thus far. You've seen this controlled selling. Are we going to see everything sell together? I guess that's kind of been a question I've been asking myself for a few weeks. Equities remain very resilient. And I would say in general, if the VIX is, I mean, they took the VIX all the way down to below 20 today, which was really surprising. I have to imagine if they take it below there again, below like 17 or 18, equities are going to rally really hard. And I don't know what that would mean for Bitcoin, for crypto. At the very least, you're going to have a huge bounce. But yeah, I mean, equities would rally very, very hard if that's the case. And the flip side of that is if they can't get full down, it just keeps doing this slow grind higher at fairly elevated levels for the VIX. I mean, let's make that clear as well. The fact that we have kind of continuously accepted above like 20 to 25 on the VIX does speak to the drain on market liquidity that I've been discussing since effectively mid-September. You know, if you get a reason to spike this, it will, and you'll see everything go at the same time. But when bottom, I think when we get that VIX spike, that will probably be your bottom. When MicroStrategy, some of these other treasury companies, I don't know what capitulation looks like for those assets, but I would like to see that to be a long-term buyer of Bitcoin again. But yeah, those are my thoughts, guys. Sorry for kind of being a doomer today. But hey, I mean, the market has been in a downtrend for 6 weeks at this point. And now I know the question that everybody's kind of asking themselves is when bottom. Hopefully this could help you a little bit with that. But thank you guys for tuning in to this week's episode of Signal with Snorlax. Reminder to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And yeah, I'll be back next week. Next week, I'm definitely interested to see where we'll be trading and where I'll be doing this video from. But I'm sure that if there's any one certainty that we can guess, it's probably going to be that next Thursday is red. But thanks, guys. Y'all have a great rest of your day. And of course, stay safe.